All right. Yeah. So that's one thing I'm noticing that like more and more. But I also noticed it here in San Antonio where people in some of the nonprofit jobs, like that's like it seems like it the radical rhetoric fits right in with the nonprofit, and so but that doesn't mean that nonprofits doing anything radical.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what, one of Matt's comments was that, in order to move up in that world, you really need to know when to come out with the radical rhetoric and when to keep a lid on it, and when and where and to who you say those kind of things. And that seems to be, if you want to climb up the ladder in the nonprofit world, you do, as you say, you have to be like somewhat radical. You have to at least sound, that way, because people, we want to think we're changing the world or something. But you also have to not rock the boat too much or, too often or too hard, because, most nonprofit, especially the big ones, like they're just like any other bureaucratic organization. And yeah, that's just kind of the reality. So once again, the takeaway I think was, with the big money nonprofits and funders and grantors and stuff like that, ideally we don't deal with them if we don't have to, and when we do, it's very strictly just you're getting money, you're not doing the strategic planning, right? And that's one thing that always bugs me, is when you have a group of nonprofit and like, corporate philanthropic, quote unquote, like types, get together and want to do the strategic plan for how we're gonna, help the poor people and the disenfranchised, and people sitting around eating caviar, strategizing about how to help the poor people. Like, no, no, we'll make the plans. Like we, and if you want to have your angel wings or whatever, fine, you can give us some money. But often it's the other way around, right? It's they want to do the planning, and they come with the money, and then they find some people in our organizations to get on
Well, so,
board.
supposedly that's what happened with at a nonprofit in Chicago. I don't know if I should say the name, but there's this one nonprofit in Chicago, and supposedly like the antagonism or like how do you say this like big open conflict that emerged was from where the spending was going to go or what the nonprofits priorities were supposed to be. And so supposedly, or maybe it was just like the last straw. And so supposedly the workers had a big disagreement with what direction the nonprofit was going to go and supposedly helping their community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what triggered this like, to me, it was like a little worker insurgency in the
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit, and there was a failed unionizing attempt. Um, and I wish I could have told them ahead of time, like, hey, you're probably not going to survive this unionizing attempt. You should probably save your energy because you have no idea the repression that they're going to hit you with.
Right.
Um, to say, fight, live to fight another day in another way. Because
Yeah.
yeah. But that was really cool that's like, that's what kind of started this battle in that nonprofit was it wasn't just about like their wages. They're thinking like big, like how are
Mm-hmm.
we impacting society? That's pretty incredible, and that happened very recently. Well, I think in the
Objected to,
past 5 years in Chicago.
they're just objecting to the kind of patronizing attitude of the nonprofit towards their target
It's
population, as they like to say.
it's possible that was part of it, but I know that there was just like this the way that it was communicated to me. They were like, "We know what our people need. It's not
Mm-hmm.
this. It's not to go in this direction. We need to go in this other direction."
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so
Yep. Yeah. Well, probably not an option in this particular scenario, but does remind me of a case. We did interviewed a woman who is a founder of a worker co-op in Wisconsin, and that co-op started when same thing, like staff insurrection at a nonprofit that was getting some big state grants, and all the workers coordinated, quit simultaneously, set up their own nonprofit, and then got the grant that the nonprofit, took the grant from the nonprofit they used to work for, and have been doing great ever since. So, I mean, yeah, for nonprofit staffers, anybody listening, if you're upset with the direction of your employing organization, that could also be an option.
And there's a GEO article for that one, right?
Yeah. Like I said, I interviewed Kathy. What's her? I can't remember her last name. It's something a little bit odd. But yeah, it's on the GEO sites. We'll let people dig around for it. I believe it's the Natural Heritage Center, something like that is the name of the co-op.
Outbid your employer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so, well, looks like for a little bit it's just going to be the two of us. Chris, you want to talk about, you were into this idea of the essential co-ops that kind of any community would need, and probably, if you're looking to start a co-op, these might be the kinds of things to start with. And there's a group, Cooperatives First, up in Canada. They have an article, I think we might have talked about a little bit in a previous live stream, but they put out last year called 5 Co-ops Every Small Town Needs. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. The ones that they list off are housing co-ops, childcare co-ops, fiber optic co-op, cooperative markets, and a community investment co-op. By market, what are they talking about? Main streets, downtowns, and city squares are the heart of their communities, and in many small towns across Western Canada, there's room to improve these community spaces. Okay, so they're talking about like farmers markets and other like spaces for craft markets and stuff like that. So yeah, repurposing empty space in buildings in the community to set up those. So that's what they came up with. My first thought being me, oh, hey, there's Matt. Hey, Matt. Was that you got the childcare co-op in there, but we got to probably need some elder care as well, especially in the small town that I live in, where we have a lot more elderly people than children needing care, I think. So, but yeah, I don't know, Chris, what was the what is it about this topic that interests you? Why'd you want to talk about it?
Well, it was, so Ajua was a person to share this article with us, and I think we talked about it, but maybe that one is not we didn't record it correctly. The way that I read this was within the framework of like, what co-ops should you start building first, like if there aren't any co-ops in your locality. And I don't know, I guess it generated more questions for me than it answered anything. It was really cool. And as I was reading this, I was thinking about our conversation about spirituality. Like within the framework of like, what co-op should you build first? One is like, if we're saying that the co-ops in the USA often, they don't kind of proceed from this like spiritual framework. And so I was wondering, like, well, let's say you gathered, spiritualists together, what would they say? How would they look at this? What would they say is like the things that need to be built out first? And then I guess 2 other things came to mind. We can probably expand on them later, which is there like a substructure, or is there like antecedent stuff that would precede developing these that people should be mindful of? And then the other one is these kind of might exist already, and nobody really knows them. They might not be organized as a government recognized co-op, but they might be like a de facto co-op, or maybe they're like just this far away. They need to be pushed a little bit more. Um, but I'll hand it over to Matt or Josh. Do y'all have anything else that you wanted to say?
I was curious what I was thinking. Like, this would be a fun question to just ask people. If you had to choose, what would be the 5 co-ops that you would choose in your area? Like, if there were, what would be the 5 indispensable types of co-ops? That's kind of how I was thinking about it. So it's kind of fun because, like, clearly this is their sort of take on that question.
Yeah. So to get at your question, Chris, about like the spirituality side, or what would, kind of thinking along those lines, I would say personally, I would think it would be my answer, would be to borrow the Buddhist term sangha, right? Like the idea being, a group of people, like just a like-minded group of people to practice together, I guess is basically what a sangha is, at least in my understanding. And that's probably, one place I would start, and where really any co-op organizing of any type of co-op really does need to start is with, at least the group of people starting the co-op spending a good bit of time together, getting on the same page as far as what their values are, and and just and learning to trust each other. But I think having, if definitely see some kind of co-op spirituality, which is really, you could say things like monasteries, or something along those lines. It's like, hey, we all want to do this thing, we're going to jointly provide for our needs to make it happen. So but yeah, I don't know, in terms of underlying infrastructure, I really think just people's attitudes is a huge aspect to it. And so any kind of educational, anything you can do to I guess introduce people to the cooperativism and the cooperative ethos, and maybe provide examples of functioning co-ops, because that always seems to be the big hang up for people who are not already familiar. Well, this sounds too good to be true. And then they'll tell you why, all the reasons it can't work. So it's always nice to have some examples on hand.
It's funny, this made me think of how Mondragon got started, right? So, like, the first thing wasn't strictly well, actually, maybe the first thing was probably the food co-op that was created, or the housing co-op. Maybe the housing co-op first and then the food co-op, but those were the 2 first cooperatives. And then there was the course, this sort of combination of kind of Catholic youth training plus mechanical training, that was the thing that trained the young people who became the founders of the Fagor cooperative, the first worker cooperative. So it's like, I think, sort of like food, housing, worker co-op, as I recall, a couple more worker co-ops, and then the bank. But maybe the bank came in pretty quickly. So it's interesting that was sort of the flow, or whatever, the process that they followed. And I don't think that wasn't by some sort of grand design. It was just responding to the situation. Huh.
Yeah, I think housing co-ops for sure, or something to reduce the cost of laying your head somewhere. That's, I would include that. I mean, it doesn't have to be a building, but what can lower those costs? But yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, something.
I had started responding to you, Matt, and realized while I'd unmuted myself on the screen, I had not unmuted my microphone on the microphone button. Anyway, so That's interesting, that the story that you have from Mondrian, because I'd always heard that it was that they started out with a stove, well, like a cook stove worker co-op, and then they
Yeah, that's the one. That's Fagor, and that was the one. It was Ulgor originally, and then they changed the name to Fagor. But that was not the first co-op.
okay, so they
And
didn't start with worker co-ops then.
No, well, no, they right, not with worker co-ops. And even more interesting, they didn't even intend. Originally, those students were trained and became mechanics, and then worked at the local ironworks factory that made locks and other kind of things out of iron. And their whole idea was that they were going to try to get the owner of that factory, who was very Catholic, to kind of, on Christian principles, move towards running it in a cooperative way. But this was like, there was very intense labor strife at that time, and there had been some pretty violent strikes. So the owner was absolutely not going to do it. The workers went on strike. The Mondragon students sided with the workers, even though they were kind of elite engineers in the factory. And then they lost their jobs, and they moved on and started that lamp, that sort of heating unit or whatever, I forget what that is, like a sort of space heater. Yeah, kind of factory. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of evolution. It wasn't really, they didn't set out to start a worker co-op in that sense. They thought they could take over an existing capitalist company and convert it.
Yeah, I mean, for me here in this, I live in a small town. This article on Cooperatives First is geared towards small towns. It sounds like, though, it's the same problem everywhere. Housing. I would personally, I would probably start with housing, and that's what I've tried to focus on here, is with not much success, unfortunately. But that's if people are struggling to keep a roof over their head, or worried about getting evicted or having to move, that makes everything else so much more difficult. And just having space to do organizing, just having some physical space that's secure, is so important for so many things. I mean, housing co-ops are also a huge, that's a tough thing to start with, maybe with a group of people, because you're living together. However, if you're already tenants in an apartment building or something like that, I definitely see tenant action turning into a conversion. And we've got the Rock USA stories, and plenty of those are mobile home parks that get converted to co-ops. But we also have some stories of apartment buildings in similar situations where the owner was going to sell and they were able to convert it. But that, and the other nice thing about a housing co-op, I think, is that it's something that's visible, that it's like it's a real, provides a real service that everybody can understand, and that it's like a physical structure in the community, that's visible, as compared to you have a web developing worker co-op or something, right? And everybody's just working from home. That's not, so another little plus, maybe.
Yeah,
Matt, you're muted.
But yeah, but assuming so I'm in an imaginary situation where I've collaborated with spiritualists, and we decided, housing co-op or something similar, for people to live somewhat safely when they go to sleep, or during the day, a little retreat sanctuary space. We all agreed on that. The one thing that I would really like to see, and maybe this is part of like that substructure, or maybe this is its own co-op, because these co-ops I think do exist, is how do we stop being so extractive? Maybe some people to help to figure that out, because I honestly, everything that I see is just like really we're kind of like going in a lot of things that are being developed are within the like momentum of the extractive economy. Um, and it's I don't even it's cool to see people who are really trying to think outside of that. And a
Mhm.
lot of people put a lot of labor into thinking about, well, yeah, I want to do this business or I'm doing this, and here are ways to be more ecological. But I think we're still very far away from that, and I think that the way that things are, when you hop into developing these things, it's very hard to, I think, not get caught up in like a hyper extractive or just extractive way of doing things. And I think there's just also having space and the comfort of at least saying like, well, we really tried to do what we can to scale back on this extraction. Um, so,
Yeah.
uh, Raul, who's your question aimed at? The question is, would this be different if you applied to a big city? What would come first there? Um,
Um, well, Chris, you're the one in the big city. And Matt, you're in a medium-sized city, I guess. And I live in Montana, so I have only visited actual cities. Probably not the guy to ask. Chris, so Chris lives in the city. You said housing. Um, any other like fundamental type co-ops you think would, like in Chicago or San Antonio, that you would think would be a good place to start?
well, I think for like essential stuff, the housing for sure I think is really relevant in a big city, um, where there is the absurd amount of rent that exists. Um, San Antonio's already there. I think maybe 10 years ago or something, people could say, well, people might think a little bit differently and say, oh no, it's not that much of an issue. But it depends on who you ask. Um, but yeah, I imagine that there would be different approaches too, though, because there's a lot of things you can't do in Chicago that you can do in a smaller town, or you also get caught more if you try to like you get narked on, so like
Trying to avoid the regulations.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and there's like the snitch culture is very strong in Chicago,
Mhm.
um, but there's some areas where I know that there's a lot of places not in Chicago where people tell me they don't have to worry about snitches calling the government because you don't have a permit, and
Mhm.
it's the neighbors that are doing it. And so it's like a totalitarianism. It's like based on neighbors snitching on each other. We're not that far from that in
Mhm.
Chicago. Um, yeah, Matt, if you have anything, go for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a couple of things. One thing is I definitely don't think that you start necessarily in the most logical place. I think it kind of starts depending on who's doing what and where there's a potential for people to work together. And like when I came back to Colorado Springs, it was not my intention to get involved in food system cooperative organizing. But as I kind of figured out where people were active and where the possibilities were and where there was the most kind of energy, it was clear that that was the place. So that became kind of where I focused. So I think it just depends a lot on that. It also depends totally on the different communities, different situations. So, like in New York, I know from a couple of worker centers, immigrant worker centers that I worked with there years ago. It was a domestic worker cooperative because they had a lot of domestic workers who were members of the worker center, and that was a kind of scattered and disorganized type of work that in a way created a real opportunity for organizing it into a worker cooperative. So, that's kind of where they started in terms of cooperative organizing. So I think it's going to be really, really different. Oh, sorry. There's my dog putting in her 2 cents. it's just going to depend a lot on the situation and then on the particular folks involved. Also in Chicago, that Street Vendors Association that, created a cooperative kitchen so that they could um, do their cooking together and then go out and independently sell food on the street. Um, that's another interesting example of something that just grew out of a community worker center approach,
Mm-hmm.
arose out of a particular situation.
Yeah, which makes me think, and probably maybe this should be the obvious answer. A little embarrassed I didn't think of it, and it immediately was, well, maybe the place to start is with like some kind of needs assessment, surveying the community, talking to people, seeing what they don't have that they need, kind of doing that sort of thing. And maybe you discover something like the cooperative kitchen for street vendors or something like that. Another good place, or is in terms of just co-ops, that I thought was maybe a good place to start was with a investment cooperative. And Matt, you're involved in one of those down in Colorado, and it seems to me, and I don't know that I can point to any particular examples, but that especially for like if you wanted to fund a housing co-op, any of these other co-ops are going to start, like, they all require funding. And so, finding a group of like-minded people to maybe start, putting some money into a fund to be able to help, and that, with the funding might be a good way to start out. And then you can, be getting to know each other while you're just raising funds before starting on a project. I don't know, Matt, you're like, is this a bad idea?
I'm just smiling because I'm like, yeah, it's a terrible idea. Because we have this thing, the Colorado Solidarity Fund. It's cool. It's great. I'm glad to be a part of it. So not a good way to start cooperative organizing. Like, it's a good thing to have and it's available.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad it exists, but I don't think it works that way. Also, I mean, in part because that whole sort of idea that Luis Rossetto preaches, that you don't need money to start a co-op, and that's putting getting the order wrong. That's whatever. There's a lot to talk about in that, but there's something to the idea to that I think is an interesting argument. But the other thing that I just wanted to throw in is this guy I just read his book. This guy Euclides Andre Manse from Brazil, who wrote this book, The Network Revolution, he's got a whole schema, which is a really interesting argument, where he says where you should start is in communities of people who are unemployed or underemployed. And the way you should start out is by getting people together to do the food purchases they already do collectively. Start forming a buyer's club, and then start organizing yourselves as a cooperative, and then start buying in bulk and doing the things that allow you to save money, and then also use that co-op to generate a solidarity fund so that you can start then giving little bits of support, but really you can then, and also to use it to do a needs assessment among the members, and then figure out what needs can be met by starting new worker co-ops in the same community. So it's a whole kind of like self-generating co-op organizing model, starting with the money people are already spending. So you don't need outside money. You just need to dedicate that money. Oh yeah, that's funny. Like the Community Purchasing Alliance. I guess it's similar, right? I need to know more. I remember I talked to folks from the Community Purchasing Alliance, but I've forgotten exactly how their model works. Isn't it churches?
Chris, maybe are you familiar with the Community Purchasing Alliance at all?
No, but if Quinn can type it about it more, I think Jim is familiar with the Community Purchasing Alliance. If it's the one that's in New York State. But yeah, I was actually thinking about doing that today with some of the new folks that have arrived from Venezuela. So let's see, Quinn wrote, yeah, I think they start by paying for trash services for churches. Yeah, I was thinking about how to help some of the folks coming in from Venezuela, and I was thinking about, well, I have a Sam's Club card, um, and I don't even use it, but I just buy almonds. That's all I use it for. Um, but I would just be a matter of coordinating it, or if they have some groups, maybe just like donate something to them to get it started, and maybe they can start saving money from there and see the value of working together to do that. But I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't get to finish that because I think my revulsion of my card and the Sam's Club kind of stopped my thinking. Um, but yeah, and I got to think about it more how to make the most of that too. And I mean, it'd be ideal if we could redirect it where we're not dealing with Sam's Club. Um, uh, yeah, cool.
Yeah, I mean, I, on a at some point you just got to bite the bullet and understand that there is no ethical consumption in capitalism, and do what works. But I really like this idea. I mean, it's of kind of starting just cooperating the stuff that everybody's already buying anyway. um, yeah, and then and building from that, creating savings. um, and I don't know how this would work. I mean, with your typical Americans who grew up in this country. But one thing that does seem very popular and common with a lot of immigrants anyway, is like the susus, right? This is relatively low. I mean, you create a savings group with a group of people that everybody puts in a certain amount of money every month or every so often, and then every month one person gets paid out the full amount, and you go around in a round like that. And and that is something Carolyn Hossein has done a lot of work on up in Canada. And she was saying that the kind of second generation folks, his parents immigrated to Canada, and now they've been kind of expanding on the susu idea and kind of bringing it into the more like the digital age. And so things like that. I've thought, I have not ever personally managed to convince other people to do a rotating savings group. Like I said, I don't know how this works with like Americans. Like, sounds good to me, but we seem few and far between. But for people from other cultures that might be a little bit more into this kind of stuff, might be could be a place to start.
That's funny. Yeah, I've been looking for takers for a Rosca or a Susu or whatever, and nobody's excited about it as I am. I'm like, man, let's just try it. It'll be great. But
right, yeah,
I can't find anybody. Everybody's kind of like, people are cautious, especially it's money. But
yeah,
can I throw in another distinction that I found fun from this guy Monset? He says he distinguishes between survival, like you could think of it as like survival cooperation, like what you do just to keep it together, and then subsistence cooperation, or where you cooperating but you're not progressing in a huge way, but you are kind of able to sort of live your life to some extent that way. And then he talks about liberation cooperation, and I feel like that it's helpful to think about those three categories. I feel like, because they're very different. When you're practicing survival cooperation, that's kind of a different deal.
Okay.
Ooh, look at Quinn's got another point. I love it.
Yeah. Quinn says, I've been daydreaming about organizing a Rosca for disabled people. We have lots of restrictions on our ability to save money. It's also just a nice way to bring folks together around mutual aid.
Ooh, I want to know more about the restrictions on ability to save money. Is that like I know one problem with
being on
disabilities,
SSI, I would imagine.
Right? There's restrictions on how much money you can make, right? There's a whole issue about.
I'm pretty sure, and Quinn can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure there are also limits on the amount of money you can have in a bank account. This has been a problem for some friends of mine on SSI that, it's like, oh, good news, distant uncle, well, good news, some distant relative passed away and you get like $5,000 or something, and it's a disaster. It's a disaster because if that money actually shows up in something that is for them, like they could lose a bunch of benefits. So it's part of that catch-22. Quince says, yes, exactly.
Okay.
Both income and savings are restricted. Yeah, due to SSI. Yeah. So, I mean, well, Quinn, here's the thought, and this is, coming from a self-described anarchist, and, I am not a lawyer, but this is why these Roscas are popular with immigrant communities. And what, Carolyn talks about a lot is that they don't, they get discriminated against often from financial institutions. And so they prefer to do things off the books, as it were. And so this is a way of doing, if it's cash transactions, you obviously probably, maybe want to keep some records among yourselves, but if you're just passing cash around and it's staying in an envelope under the mattress or whatever. Yeah, we're good.
The other thing I know that I saw her in Toronto in June at a co-op conference, and they also told the story that and maybe we've covered this in GEO, I don't remember, about how they had this really successful Rosca going, and it was pretty significant amount of money, and they're like, we need to just put this money in the bank. So they tried to create a bank account for their Rosca, and as soon as the money went in, it was seized by the police, who thought it was some sort of money laundering scheme, because they're like, who are all these immigrants with all this money trying to get everybody's name on the account? It wasn't usual, so they found it. And so it was another version of that discrimination again. It was like, even if you try to do it, opening a regular bank account, et cetera, they're still going to come down on you for being who you are. So yeah, I think that's, but I don't know. Yeah, there's no reason. I mean, there's nothing. A Rosca by itself is it's not an investment tool. There's nothing that would need to be regulated. It's just friends moving money around amongst themselves. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I would, and the problem would be for, when the month that you get paid out, if that goes into a bank account, then, like I said, that could mess with things, but cash exists. So yeah. I'm a big fan of that. But yeah. So Roscas. What else? What are some other threads on this that we can pull on? They mention in there the Wi-Fi or broadband co-op, and that is something that also I think is not just a rural area issue. And I know of at least one project, and I'm sure there's others doing creating community-free Wi-Fi services in a co-op kind of manner. Looks like we got another chat coming in. How could a person living in a rural area contribute to the efforts of creating co-ops? Maybe try to establish a close connection to their closest small town and city. This is, well, I'll tell you, in Montana, I live in rural Montana, and it was pretty easy to make a connection with the Montana Cooperative Development Center. Easier to make a connection than to get a whole lot of help out. And they were helpful, but are also super busy. But making, because they work all across the state and mostly in larger places than my little city of 500 doesn't really rate. But so, yeah, I mean, that is a good idea. I hadn't thought about, maybe I should drive over to Plains and start hanging up some flyers over there. But that is, one of the main issues we run into in rural areas is just the lack of people, right? There's not that many
Mhm.
people, and if this is something that only 5% are going to be into, or 2%, then yeah, it gets pretty thin pickings pretty quick. So I don't know. That's it's not probably a good answer, but that's all I got. Matt, you have any thoughts out? I mean, you're
I
not really
mean,
from Colorado.
it's interesting because it's hard to say, like there's much more co-op activity in some rural towns in Colorado than there is in Colorado Springs, which is the second biggest city. So it's not like automatic that there's going to be more in a small town or in a city at all. But I can see like the main thing I feel like at the beginning, it's just consciousness that this even exists as a possibility is a really big. That's our first stumbling block, is because we have people who will create something like a co-op. They don't know that there is this great Colorado co-op law. They don't bother to make them co-ops. They just start a whatever, and they invent a form that using standard business legal status, purely because they don't know that there's any other alternative. So I feel like some of it is just like, yeah, exposure and being aware that there are people out there who you could talk to and ask about it. I think the peer-to-peer thing is really good here. If you can find somebody to talk to,
Yeah.
In that nearby town or wherever, who has some experience. But I think in some ways, there are advantages to being in a smaller place in a sense that, it's easier to know the players. There's often just more, there's not as much big wealth around. So there's not as many layers of people being pulled off by all that big money. I feel like there's a little, sometimes if it's agricultural, there's a little bit more of a culture of helping each other out. And it just seems to me to be the case in some of the towns in Colorado compared to our city.
Yeah, I'm wary about the like the so-called cities or the urban areas, urban conurbations, because man, start picking up the things that they're doing. I don't think that's good because a lot of them are like really bad role models for economic development. Like Chicago, like you go in there, you see all these liars, lots of liars. You don't. It's just like normal for people to be lying to each other and ripping each other off and using the latest lingo that sounds progressive. But then also like co-ops, they're supposed to be autonomous, and I don't know how that can happen in a lot of these urban areas. There's like everything's based on so much stuff is based. The economy is based on grabbing stuff from outside of the locality, and that might be the case for almost every, I don't know, for a lot of places in the United States and a lot of places throughout the world right now. But maybe some of the rural areas are good where it's not as prominent. They can still survive without having to get so much from outside the locality. So I would be wary about that when it comes to connecting with the urbanized areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's also another part of that, which is the nonprofit industrial complex, as they say. Cities and towns, you're going to find a lot more nonprofits occupying, sort of filling up this space where co-op development could be happening.
So
that can be an obstacle.
We started off, we're actually having a little discussion on some NPIC topics right at the beginning, Matt.
Okay.
I didn't name any names, but yeah, we get the it's that is an issue. It's probably worth pointing out. I mean, because it's co-ops keep. I mean, I've been doing the GEO stuff and kind of paying attention to worker co-op space for like a decade now, and it seems like it's just getting more and more popular. More people from other parts of society are coming in and trying to like use co-ops in different ways, and with and there's money going into co-op development, so you do get like Matt said, the nonprofit co-op developers and stuff like that who you might do more harm than good getting involved with them. It really depends. That was kind of our my my thing at the beginning to start off with was, and this was from you, Matt, like in terms of these kind of larger, well-resourced, to use the lingo, organizations, who you might like get in contact with. Largely, it's like we want to go there and get like money from them, and not necessarily have them like be doing our planning and stuff like that. But I do think, like, most states have a co-op development center, and although a lot of them are very focused on kind of rural ag co-ops, worker co-ops and other types of co-ops are also in their wheelhouse, and it's always worth at least trying to get a hold of them just to make a connection.
I guess the one thing I would throw in on that is just in my experience here, there's some nice folks out there. The people who are relevant to me are in Denver, and it just isn't, it's far enough away to not actually be out much use. Like, it's really on us to do our own co-op organizing if it's going to be meaningful. And like, it's great to have allies. And I know that once we get organized, those are folks we can collaborate with and we can do good work, but you just have to do it yourself. It's like, it's like anything, right?
Yeah.
Don't give up the agriculture, though. The agricultural co-ops. That's great. That's great that they, that they have them. Because that's something that a lot of people are trying to do in Chicago right now. And I don't know if it's related to the fact that people try to rise up in Chicago in 2020. And it seemed like people stopped trying to rise up once all the food stores were closed down. I think Peter Kropotkin talked about that in The Conquest of Bread, where he was like, if you don't have food, don't your uprising ain't gonna work.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's really not much. The way I understand, there's not really much local food produced in Chicago. People are trying it, and I think sometimes one thing I notice about people in rural areas is that it doesn't seem cool, whatever. But if the rural area is producing food, that's amazing. Don't lose that. It's super cool. And there's definitely like cultural conflicts that people got to navigate for why they don't think that's cool. But I think also that's not I believe that there's probably something systemic about making that seem like it's not cool, because we're very disempowered. We're not producing our own food. I was at a protest for the Iranian Revolution. I don't know if it was earlier this year or I think it was earlier this year. And I was actually talking to a security guard. She was telling me, we need to produce our own food. And what was she saying? Like, our parents and our grandparents, they used to farm, and it was predicted. She goes, I remember when I was in like college or high school, one of the teachers predicted that all these diseases were going to be increasing because we were losing connection with farming. And she was talking specifically about minorities, that there's like this prediction that we're going to be getting more diabetes and all this other stuff because we're losing that connection with farming. Something's going on, and I think she was right, and I think that's something that's going on. And at some point, it became uncool, and or something really happened, shifted our habits, and we're not doing that, and we got to go back. And it's really cool to live in a rural area where you're farming. I think that's super cool. Don't think that the city's cool, because the cities, a lot of times, they're not self-sufficient. That's not a model.
No, it's not. And I mean, and maybe this is kind of the connecting thread with Raul's. All right, we want Quinn's comment up there still. All right, but this is the maybe the connection with Raul's previous comment about establishing connection between the city and the rural areas. I mean, I've had this idea, I've unsuccessfully tried, but like the real connection needs to be a people connection, which is kind of maybe what Chris is getting at. Like out here in the rural areas, our major problem is we ain't got nobody. Like we're just a lack
Right.
of people power. And in, you know, the urban areas, you got, okay, all kinds of people, but you don't have any land. There's no space to do
Right.
anything, or it's so expensive to access that space. And it's getting that way out here in the rural areas too, but it's definitely a lot better. And like I would,
Mhm.
you know, that would be a dream come true if you could, you know, if I could like make connections with the people in Missoula who are the back to the lander types, or who want to, you know, do something in a rural area and are into co-ops, and get them, you know, figure out a way to like move some population out.
Mhm.
And yeah, and Chris, you're very right. Like cities are not self-sufficient, and I have definitely had to bite my tongue a couple times in conversations with some folks who, you know, are very progressive and live in cities, and have told me that, you know, it's the only environmentally right sustainable thing to do. You got to live in the city because city dwellers use less energy and stuff like that. And I just think, where do you think all your food comes from, though? Like, you're not
Yeah.
growing it in Manhattan, friend. I'm
Mhm.
sorry. Like, so some of us got to be out here, you know, doing that. So, um, yeah, and but I think there is
Yeah.
a lot of stigma. I don't know how much there is. I think it's less among white folks, but I have heard from African American folks specifically that there's a stigma involved with like working the land, you know, working in agriculture. Like that's something that we left, right? And there's still a lot of people, you know, want to have a modern existence, and there's, you know, it's and farming is not easy. And so it's, you know, I think there can be certainly a stigma there. And you know, I certainly you know, imagine a lot of folks who, you know, getting out of the agriculture industry, that's a big step for you and your family, like not have to work in a field anymore. Like the idea of going back there voluntarily might be a little bit hard to swallow. I mean, it definitely found that for some people, but
Hmm.
I think we got to get over it, because the reality is that the upper middle class, like modern American lifestyle that everybody seems to want, is completely unsustainable. Like even for the folks who have it now, much less for more people. And so, like, yeah, anyway. Personally, I think we need some kind of degrowth attitudes, but I am admittedly a radical. So Quinn's comment, I did put it back up. Agriculture co-ops ideally would help facilitate land back, rematriation of land, and recommoning of land. Ideally, yes. Unfortunately, I mean, the most of the agriculture co-ops in the country, and this is definitely not all, but the big ones, it's often very difficult to tell the difference between the large ag co-ops and just, you know, your Cargills of the world. So like Cenex, for instance, is a ag co-op, and you know, there are others, Ocean Spray and stuff like that. You know, some better, some worse, but the you know, facilitating land back and stuff like that. I mean, it's certainly you know, I think co-ops and agriculture co-ops, especially smaller ones formed of more radical people, certainly a place where those kind of discussions can take place. And but yeah, you know, in the present, the big agriculture co-ops are often pretty conservative. So, but the smaller ones being started by the younger folks, definitely more into that. So we need more of it.
Yeah, I was gonna throw in on that. I think the because exactly like here, if you say ag co-ops, mostly people take that to mean the large ones that Josh was talking about, which are usually producer co-ops, right? It's big farms going in together on marketing or, you know, transportation or whatever, or insurance. Um, that kind of like collective work on the land, collective land ownership kind of approach is way more unusual. And that's really a challenge here, because the dominant model is like, if it's not a great big farm, it's a small, often like a family farm. And for them to grow, they, their model would be to hire farm workers. And on a very standard capitalist model, there isn't a strong kind of cooperative farm model. In New England, I think there's a lot more examples of actually good functioning collectives and cooperative farms that are doing good work. But here it's pretty, most ag co-ops people talk about it's just marketing and selling and distributing. One guy who I work with is really interested in the commons idea. And there's a group called Agrarian Commons that promotes a sort of way in which you can convert private agricultural land into a commons type structure. And so we're looking at sort of how do you combine the land commoning thing plus the cooperative distribution and consumption piece plus some sort of labor element, if we can try to figure out some sort of way to organize something like a farm labor cooperative. This is really small. I'm talking right now, just teeny, 1 or 2 farms, a dozen people. But if we're trying to figure out these kind of ways to combine these different factors and cooperation on a bunch of different levels as a way to try to get at this stuff.
So the agricultural co-ops and the let's see.
I did that.
Wait, let's see.
Chris doesn't want to be. All right, playing with StreamYard here. Sorry.
So the agriculture co-ops and the producer co-ops, they can be pretty ugly because they can benefit people who say like own the land or something, but the laborers who are actually doing the work can be totally excluded from the co-op. Right. So it just reminds me of what Josh was saying about how the term worker co-op is, you can manipulate it in a way where it's just some really ugly thing happening. Do we have to create something else or be more another term for this stuff? Because that's when I hear agriculture co-op or producer co-op, one of the things that comes to my mind is that, like, who are the farmers? And I've seen some of the websites, so I'm like, that's not who's, the farmers. I'm like, I really doubt you're the ones doing the farming. I don't know, but that's what we're supposed to be doing, I think.
Yeah. The guy
GEO's
wearing
like a catalyst to overcome this hypocrisy and put people on guard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, you watch, see pictures from like a general meeting for Cenex Harvest States co-op, and yeah, a lot of guys in suits and very fancy cowboy boots that, and yeah, they're farmers in the sense that they own the land and pay other people to actually work it. So, but there are, since we've been ragging on ag co-ops a little bit, there's, some good examples. Western Montana Growers Cooperative in my part of the world is a co-op, a distribution and marketing co-op for small organic producers. And so the existence of that co-op has made a lot of other, like a lot of small farms, like viable and able to actually produce, because they don't have to think about how am I getting this to the grocery store, or where am I going to sell this stuff. So smaller marketing and producer co-ops can be good and liberatory and all that. And then there's some farm co-ops just on the strictly production side. There are some like worker co-ops, farms. The one I'm thinking of specifically, I believe, is in Maine, and it was started by some Somali immigrants. And I think the other, I think I heard of another one that was also like African immigrants starting a collective farm, which makes a ton of sense to me, because like I was saying, with like I think the stigma maybe around being a farmer is a little bit less if you come from a place where that's a profession for lots of people. And, so, yeah. So make friends with the immigrant communities if you want to get into farming. That would be my advice. Like literally, our farmers market in Missoula, it's 80% Hmong farmers. Like if it weren't for our Hmong population, we would not have a farmers market, guaranteed. So if I was super serious about getting to ag, I would be making friends with some of those folks. Yeah. Well, we've hit our hour mark. We officially are off the clock. We're no longer being paid our absurd wages for doing this. So if we need to go, we can wrap it up. But anybody got any last thoughts or anything you wanted to talk about we didn't get a chance to hit on? No?
No. What was the thing that you wanted to talk about, Josh?
What was the thing that I wanted to talk
'Cause
about?
I thought you proposed something else.
Oh, I did propose something else. Oh, yes. So, I mean, this is it's. I'll throw it out there as an idea. Just and I don't know if people are already doing this or not, but it occurs to me. All right, we have people starting up when you're starting up your co-op, your worker co-op specifically, looking, trying to get funding, figuring out how to capitalize the thing. The ways that a traditional business might do it, especially at least larger ones, would be to sell shares, stock. The co-op version of that is preferred shares. My thought is, why don't co-ops, existing worker co-ops, use some of their reserves, assuming they have some, to invest in preferred shares from startup or existing worker co-ops? The idea being that wouldn't it be cool if worker co-ops, part of their reserve was kept in preferred shares and other co-ops, which seems to me would be both a way to get funding for worker co-ops. If you're starting up a worker co-op, you could offer preferred shares to other worker co-ops and have that as a way to get some funding. It's also going to be beneficial for the co-op that's purchasing the share, hopefully. And then it's also just creating connections and networks, and not just personal, hey, I met that guy and he was cool at the conference or whatever, but we have a monetary investment in your business. So we have an interest in making sure that your business is successful so that we can get paid back, so we can fund our retirement account or whatever. But rather than, worker co-ops, if they become successful and have reserves, putting that money in 401ks or something, well, we have preferred shares. Why don't, could we do that? So anyway, that is the outlines of the idea. Maybe a little bit big to start with at the hour mark, but I don't know. Matt, you have any thoughts? You want to tell me why it's a terrible idea and can't work?
Just because all your ideas are terrible.
I know. We got to keep you around.
No, I don't know if it's a terrible idea. Seems like it's like I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting thing to explore. Yeah. The closest thing I know of is they created at first these regional bodies at Mondragon back in the day, and then they made them industrial instead of regional. First it was just by geography, and then it was by industry. But the concept was, all the co-ops join this in a particular industry. For example, join the industrial second level co-op, and then they put in a big percentage of their profits, and the profits are controlled by the whole group and not just by the individual co-op. And so that gave them huge flexibility to fund each other through hard times or through new projects or through whatever. So it's a pretty powerful example. But I think the key thing there was it wasn't just one-on-one relations. It was everybody doing this together as a group,
Right.
which I think is probably important.
Yeah, I mean, and a little bit like what the Arizmendi Association does, right, with their member co-ops. Each of them puts back some portion of their
Right.
net profits back into the development fund.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know what else I was going to say about that. That sounds to me like an indivisible reserve, I believe is what they're called. I just posted a little like last
Yeah.
week video from Marty Frost, co-op developer in Canada, worker co-op developer, and making the case for indivisible reserves, which are some portion of the worker co-op's profits that are held by the co-op, not distributed to individual members, and that
Right.
cannot ever be distributed to individual members, as a mechanism to like make sure that the co-op doesn't get demutualized. And then so it sounds like this kind of a group way of doing some indivisible reserves to create a fund that you can do stuff with, and then everybody's invested. It's it I would love to see that in the US. Again, I feel like our culture might make that kind of thing really difficult. I remember talking at a conference several years ago with worker co-op people from Puerto Rico, and that's the system they have there. All of the co-ops are required by law to put some small percentage of their profits into a co-op development organization, and therefore they have very well-funded co-op development organizations. So when you want to start a co-op, you have a ton of help, right? It's already paid for by all the other co-ops, and there's like, you guys should do that. Like, it's a great system, but yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. I would say it's not developed. In some cases it is, but mostly not. But in theory, some of the small business development centers around the country, which like in our case are funded in part through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, I think, but also through COEDIT, which is a Department of Industry and Technology or something, or Industry and International Trade. I don't know. Anyway, there's money from the state that goes to these, and from the feds that goes to these small business development centers. And in one case in Colorado near Denver, there's one that's very focused on co-op development. Like they really want it. The one that's closer to me, they don't know what co-ops are. So there's very different experiences, but there are some resources out there in that sense. They're not from co-ops, they're not by co-ops, in most cases. So I think the idea of co-ops developing their own education process and their own education funds is great, especially if it's on that peer-to-peer model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
All right. Chris, go for it.
The question is like, why aren't they doing it? At this point, I'm beginning to think that a lot of reason why co-ops aren't helping each other out is because there's a lot of beef. At least maybe that explains enough of it. I remember a few years ago, there's some cooperatives who started talking about they called it white supremacy politeness, and why like there's like problems underneath the surface that were paralyzing people from being able to work together, and this was among folks of color too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, folks of color, we're not talking about these problems that we need to be talking about. Yeah, I wonder to what extent that is rampant and prohibiting a lot of these good ideas from being able to happen. Because while y'all were talking about this, I was just thinking about how like I seen some people with like their jobs, the job description says that they connect people, and I was just thinking like, yeah, it'd be nice if there was people who were doing that in the co-op stuff. But honestly, if I were to connect this and that co-op, there's gonna be beef. I don't know if they'll be able to smooth that out. Yeah, so we need people to squash the beef. Professional like beef squashers or
the beef squashers co-op. You could start a co-op. Other co-ops could hire you to help squash the beef.
And there would probably be some great stories about how that goes wrong.
I could
We
totally
meant
see that.
well.
Yeah, we ended up
But
just
for the-
making smash burgers because we couldn't. It's the only beef we could smash.
That'd be good fuck up Fridays, right? But I dissolved the co-op today because I did not squash the beef with the right way.
I mean, I'd see that kind of dynamic more in the co-op developer world and people chasing after grants more so than in the co-ops, among co-ops themselves. I'm sure there's some I don't know about, but certainly I think, I mean, I know for a fact there's like, and I can be part of some of these like dynamics and interactions. Like there are people who just do not get along with each other. Or they've, had conflict in the past and, probably are not saying anything about it in public, but, will just refuse to work with that person because of XYZ, that went down before. I mean, I know for a fact there are people who will not work with me because of things I've written, so that's fine. As long as only the right kind of people are getting mad at you, I think that's the real issue.
Yeah, that would be a good topic of conversation. Because like, I'm convinced that like people talk a lot about conflict resolution and doing conflict resolution work and all that. And I kind of feel like once you're there, it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
Like the work needs to be done not once there's conflict, it needs to be done earlier on to build the trust and solidarity and understanding that minimizes the development of that stuff. It's like, it's not, I think paying consultants to a facilitator to come in from outside and get you to all try to work through your stuff is not a very efficient way to deal with this. It's like more about like, why is what work wasn't done initially that then created all the possibilities for this stuff to come up. That's my question.
I mean, but you only can do that. Like you can do that within organizations, right? You can,
right.
But how do you do that between different, groups of people where they don't have any agreed process? They never sat down to figure it out.
Just have to start developing that by the same way. Just communicating and figuring it out.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's part of it, and it probably plays into the beef aspect, and I don't want to like be casting aspersions or anything, but I think whenever money is involved, that often is what causes the problems. And because we all need money to live, people are, get grabby about it, and that can cause a lot of problems. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's why I've seen it mostly in the developer field.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's about when and where money comes in. Mm-hmm. That's the problem, I think. Because money always comes in at the beginning, it creates a whole lot of distortion on the way that relationships are developed and distrust and all that grabbiness and all that stuff,
Yep.
I do think that's partially symptomatic of like the way people think of developing business, which is just the standard business concept of how you develop business. You get money from investors, pull together a bunch of people to do whatever is going to give you the most money in return. Right. And that's the business plan.
Yeah. 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 No, I had a conversation with somebody recently who was being a little bit despairing. Got to know her when she was younger, more idealistic, and just like, man, everybody I came up with is now like chasing that NPIC bag, just trying to get a, $75K a year salary. And that's what it's about, right? The work is just like the excuse for getting the salary, kind of is what she was saying. Like, it's like, yeah, I feel like for a lot of people, maybe that becomes a thing at some point. But and to me, I don't know, this was, I guess, will be my my last point, I swear I'll shut up after this. Trust, like the incredible importance of trust, and that we're really bad at accepting that fact that like we can have everything figured out. And if we don't have trust, it ruins all that stuff. All your planning and logistics don't mean a damn. But if you have a group of people who does like trust each other, then you can get a lot of work done. You can figure the other stuff out. But, you know, when, yeah, again, I can imagine a place like Chicago, and it's the same. I'm in New York City is where I've heard plenty of stories from, and other parts of the country. But, you know, it's like when there's money comes in and then people in the city, it's like, oh, there's money for this co-op development or whatever. And people start going after it because, you know, everybody, again, a lot of folks are struggling. So you can't really blame people for trying to get paid. But then that becomes a problem. So building the trust, yeah. And I mean, I don't know how you do that in Chicago, frankly, but you know, I have no idea. I've never even been to Chicago. So you tell me.
Yeah, I don't know. It's changing. I mean, throughout the years, you know, I hear people saying it's a cultural thing that's been emerging, that neighbors trust each other less and less in Chicago. It's the pattern that's been happening. Um, you know, how do you change that substructure? I feel like during the pandemic, I felt like people started to trust each other more, and I've kind of already begun to forget what it was like when people trusted each other less prior to the pandemic. But I feel like the pandemic kind of changed things, and maybe it's just because so many people were helping each other out, like helping out strangers and stuff. I feel like things have changed a bit to where there is more trust among people, but I can easily see that going away.
Let's pray for another pandemic, I guess, right?
No.
Well, don't worry. We're going to get one. Whether we're wanting it or
Well,
not. I mean, that
so
is,
from the defrosting of like viruses and at the polls and
Oh my God, I just read a book based on this premise.
yeah.
That one that Emmy recommended, How High We Go in the Dark, it's called. The premise is all exactly that. A virus pops up in Siberia or gets into a researcher, boom, spreads, wipes people out like on a colossal level around the world, and then all the things that fall out from that. It's pretty well imagined.
Co-ops losing trust with each other, and
this one didn't have any co-ops. It was more, families losing trust. It was all just kind of, and also the industry, the kind of complex, the sort of funeral industry that kind of got built around that scenario. It's kind of very intense. But anyway, well, on that pleasant note,
yes,
we should wind up.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure, gentlemen, and we will do this again in a month.
Too bad that Adjoa couldn't join us. I know she.
Yeah, Adjoa and Malakia sent me a text too as we were starting, said she couldn't make it tonight, but
yeah,
hopefully next month.
Yeah, that would be cool.
All right. Thanks.
All right, y'all.
Everybody.